According to Reuters, wholesale egg prices in the U.S. hit a record high of $4.95 per dozen earlier this year, prompting a Justice Department investigation into whether major producers withheld supply to jack up costs. Just weeks later, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reportedly asked European countries, including Denmark, to export eggs to America in an effort to ease the domestic shortage. This is not just a food story, it is a systemic shock rippling across trade, policy, and livelihoods. Please help us reach 1,000 subscribers and complete today's 500-like challenge. Your comment may be featured in our next report, so please share your thoughts below and subscribe for daily, verified updates. The United States finds itself in a brutal paradox. Egg prices are soaring at the same time supermarkets brim with imports, while domestic producers struggle under collapsing export markets. The government is now scrambling to plug a widening supply gap amid allegations of price collusion, trade retaliation, and policy missteps. Since 2022, a virulent avian influenza outbreak has led to the loss of more than 160 million birds nationwide, damaging the egg supply. By early 2025, grocery shelves in parts of the U.S. were stocking eggs labeled "Product of Brazil" or "Packed in Turkey," even as domestic farmers faced unsold surpluses. In March, USDA officials reportedly reached out to Denmark and several EU nations seeking emergency egg imports to calm domestic markets. Meanwhile, tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, aimed at protecting U.S. agriculture, are alleged to have backfired, cutting off key export markets and intensifying oversupply at home. At the core, who suffered, who bet wrong, and how did a policy designed to defend domestic farming become a catalyst for collapse? The chain of failure begins with bird flu. Since 2022, the H5N1 avian influenza strain has decimated flocks across multiple states, forcing producers to cull tens of millions of laying hens. Output plunged, pushing wholesale egg prices skyward and straining an already fragile supply chain. By early 2025, retail prices soared. In many urban markets, a dozen eggs were selling for $4.95 or more, nearly a 60% year-on-year increase. The Justice Department, citing a Wall Street Journal report, opened a preliminary investigation into possible industry collusion, exploring whether some producers deliberately held back supply to maintain high prices. Yet, even as domestic supply tightened, Americans increasingly saw imported egg cartons in stores, labels reading Brazil, Turkey, or South Korea. The irony, domestic producers watched foreign imports undercut them, while those seeking to supply the same domestic market faced soaring costs and legal barriers. At the same time, the Trump administration's tariff regime complicated trade dynamics. The U.S. announced a baseline tariff of 10% on agricultural imports, including eggs from Turkey and Brazil, with South Korea facing a 26% tariff in a bid to favor domestic producers. But many analysts warned that such tariffs would raise costs further and discourage supply. The domino effect extended into export markets. Canadian buyers, some of America's most reliable customers, began scaling back orders quietly, citing higher costs and shifting supply sources. Meanwhile, U.S. surplus eggs exploded, cold storage facilities filled, logistical bottlenecks clogged, and small farms that lacked buffer capital face margin collapse. In parallel, U.S. regulators filed suit against the state of California in July 2025, challenging its stricter egg welfare and size regulations because they drive up national egg prices by imposing burdens on interstate producers. The federal government claims those state standards conflict with the National Egg Products Inspection Act and create uneven burdens. In Iowa's rural counties, longtime family farms now sit dark and silent. The once bustling barns are empty. Decades of generational knowledge are vanishing overnight. One former poultry farm owner in Iowa told local reporters they have 12 million dozen eggs stuck in cold storage that cannot find buyers, producing just enough revenue to cover utility bills, not labor or debt, local media estimate. In Pennsylvania, small farmers described the heartbreak of watching their flocks culled, while grocery shelves back home fill with imported eggs. The emotional toll runs deeper than lost income. Identity, pride, and legacy feel undermined. Consumers, too, feel the strain. A dual shock, prices rising even as domestic supply remains stagnant. A 2025 survey of 2,400 Midwest households by a Purdue University-linked group found that 68% had no idea why imports persist while domestic farms struggle. More than half called it absurd that American eggs face export rejection at the very moment consumers pay more. Frustration surfaces in local community boards and Facebook groups. An Ohio resident posted, "My store sells Brazilian eggs for nearly $5 a dozen. 5 miles away, a local farm can't offload its stock." That sense of betrayal between policy promises and lived reality is becoming a recurring theme in small towns across the Midwest. Just when the economic and emotional narrative seems exhausted, here's the twist. Government officials are now suing states over their own egg regulations and pushing trade retaliation, intensifying the conflict rather than calming it. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Your support keeps independent journalism alive. With U.S. exports faltering, foreign buyers have quietly pivoted. Canada, historically a major importer of U.S. eggs, is diversifying supply chains and cutting back on American orders. Reports suggest Canada is sourcing more eggs from Brazil, the European Union, and other suppliers. The U.S. has also begun increasing egg imports from Turkey, South Korea, and Brazil to fill the domestic gap. In 2025, Turkish egg exports to the U.S. are expected to increase roughly sixfold over last year's baseline of 71 million eggs. In February, Brazil's exports to the U.S. surged 57.5% year-on-year. Yet global challenges loom. European producers themselves face bird flu outbreaks and tight margins. The Danish Egg Association, for instance, told Reuters that they do not currently have a meaningful surplus to send to the U.S., citing hygiene regulations and supply constraints. This means America is now competing in the global scramble for eggs, a position it once dominated. As buyers diversify, U.S. leverage weakens. At its core, this saga is not just about eggs. It's a microcosm of trade, trust, and policymaking in a fragile global system. Economically, the failure arises from a misalignment. Protectionist tariffs meant to shelter U.S. farmers ended up closing export markets and isolating domestic supply. Tariffs raised import costs, stifled competition, and muddied incentives. Meanwhile, buyers turned elsewhere, exacerbating oversupply of domestic stocks. Politically, the tension lies in promises versus outcomes. Donald Trump campaigned on lowering grocery costs. Eggs became a touchstone of credibility. But as prices soared and consumers balked, the administration shifted to emergency supply requests and legal counterattacks. The filing of a lawsuit against California underscores how such crises transition from market failures to federal versus state showdowns. In terms of trade strategy, when a country that once dominated agricultural export markets becomes a buyer, asking neighbors for eggs, it signals erosion of soft power, especially in food security. This flip from supplier to demander reshapes global bargaining dynamics. Experts likely will see this as a cautionary tale. When agricultural policy is weaponized, it can quickly push supply chains into chaos. Trust erodes between farmers and government, between nations. Legitimacy becomes as crucial as yield. The U.S. egg crisis is a symptom of deeper fractures, supply fragility, policy overreach, and geopolitical recalibration. Key takeaway: protectionism without flexibility can backfire. In agriculture, trust and market access weigh as heavily as production capacity. Looking ahead, the U.S. must recalibrate, restore export confidence, renegotiate tariffs, and rebuild relationships with global partners. How Washington handles this crisis could become a blueprint for future trade disputes in critical commodities. What happens next is critical. Will farmers recover? Will new policies reverse the damage or entrench isolation? Watch this space. For now, subscribe to Maple States, share your views in the comments below, and hit like if you believe food security should never become a political gamble.